Hello, I'm William Brackney, the Director of the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies at Acadia Divinity College and Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Welcome to the 2014 Jarold K. Zeman Memorial Lectures. Our lecturer this year is Dr. James M. Stayer, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Educated at Juniata College, the University of Virginia, and Cornell University, where he received his doctorate, Dr. Stayer previously taught at Bridgewater College in Virginia and Bucknell University in Pennsylvania before coming to Queen's. He is one of the most well-known scholars of the Radical Reformation internationally. Professor Stayer's book, Anabaptist and the Sword, was a groundbreaking interpretation, introducing a completely new orientation to Anabaptist origins. The Anabaptists were a part of the Radical Reformation of the 16th century, characterized by a rich congregational life that was steeped in the Scriptures, symbolized in believers' baptism, and having a broad ethnic diversity. Dr. Stayer focuses in this lecture on the Hutterites, a communal branch of the Anabaptist movement that had its origin in the 1530s. We now join the first of two lectures entitled Jarold K. Zeman and the Trajectory of Moravian Anabaptist History at the K.C. Irving Center on the campus of Acadia University.
So, I'm so happy to get this invitation to come to this lovely part of Canada and to get in contact with Jerry Garrett's again. We've been exchanging Christmas greetings over the years. I've kept up with some of the vicissitudes of his life, and we've always remained good friends, and thank you very much, Jerry, for the kind invitation, the kind comments about my work, and I'm also very happy to be here at an event commemorating the work of Dr. Jarold Zeman. I've always respected Jarold Zeman's work. We were in contact around the late 60s when both of us were starting into our publication careers. And I regret that I haven't been in closer contact with him, but an appreciation of his work and accomplishment is one way to catch up on that deficit. When I was invited to give the Zeman lecture for 2014, it occurred to me that it was appropriate to situate Jarold Zeman as a churchman and historian. As a Baptist minister, Zeman was aware that the Baptist tradition began in 17th century England in an encounter between radical English Puritans and continental Dutch Mennonite Anabaptists. There's continuing debate about whether the Baptist tradition was substantively indebted to continental Anabaptism, or whether there was simply an analogy between the two groups. As I understand from my visit here, already there are going to be some further publications on that subject coming out of the group in Acadia. But anyhow, Jarold Zeman came from a background in the Bohemian Brethren. He came from a Bohemian Brethren family before he joined the Baptist. And he was interested, he interested himself in a historical problem that in many ways was parallel to the analysis of the encounter between early English Baptists and Dutch Mennonites. In his doctoral dissertation, which when published became the classical monograph, a classical book on the subject, he studied the striking similarities between the Bohemian Brethren and 16th century Anabaptists. With his impressive knowledge of Czech and German sources, he investigated the 16th century Moravia as the place where there was an encounter between Anabaptist and the Czech Reformation. The Czech Reformation tendencies and the Anabaptist groups lived in immediate proximity to each other, but he decided eventually that they missed their opportunity for a closer interaction or fusion with each other, because the Anabaptists were mostly immigrants from Germany, German-speaking, and the Czechs were, of course, Czech-speaking at that time. They hadn't been partly Germanized, as occurred after the Counter-Reformation, and there was he concluded, an insuperable historical barrier, cultural barrier between the two. His meticulous research, however, provides a starting point for the ongoing research on Anabaptism in Moravia that's been carried on by scholars who were active in his last years and after his death. Werner Packel, who Jerry has mentioned, and Martin Rothkegel, whom some of you know as a fellow of the Acadia Centre for Anabaptist and Baptist Studies. The history of Anabaptism in Moravia is a story to which Zeman made a very important contribution. Like all histories, but perhaps even more than most, Moravian Anabaptist history is only as good as its source material. Zeman contributed to the enriching of the source materials on Moravian Anabaptism in ways that I'll describe for you. And then he went on to subject the sources of Moravian Anabaptism to critical analysis. There's still gaps in the record and still unresolved problems in the history of Moravian Anabaptism, which demand the application of hypothesis and scholarly imagination. History isn't an exact science. Jarold Zeman is a mediating figure between the beginning of the study of Anabaptism in Moravia and its present state. As a matter of fact, Jarold K, who has an ongoing association with this institution, can very well be considered as Zeman's successor. Now, what I'm going to do is to give you a bit of a picture about how Jarold Zeman changed the emphases in the study of Moravian Anabaptism of the sort that he found when he began his academic career here at Acadia in the late 60s. Modern Moravian Anabaptist history began with the discovery and collection of Hutterite manuscripts by Joseph von Beck, who was a judicial official of the Habsburg monarchy in the middle of the 19th century. The Hutterites were chased out of Moravia and exiled to Slovakia in 1622 at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. And when the Slovakian Hutterites were finally suppressed entirely by Jesuit missionaries in the 18th century, their manuscripts were confiscated and placed in libraries and archives in Slovakia. Beck made a strong avocation of collecting Hutterite manuscripts. And ultimately in 1883, he published a German book, which in English translation would be the history books of the Anabaptist in Austria-Hungary. When Beck died, his manuscript collection was utilized by Johann Loserth, who was a professor at the University of Graz. Loserth had been, above all, a specialist in the study of Jan Hus, of the Czech Reformation before the Reformation, which occurred about 100 years before Martin Luther. After Beck did his work, he had to confess that he hadn't been able to find the really important, the really central chronicle of the Hutterites that described their history in the early years. There was a missing great chronicle of the Hutterites that Beck very much wanted to find, but he didn't know how to go about it. At that point, a third Austrian historian, professor of German literature at the University of Vienna, Rudolf Vulcan, published a book in German in 1903 whose title is translated as The Songs of the Anabaptist. Now, Beck, Loserth, and Vulcan all thought that the Hutterites died out, simply disappeared when the Jesuits forced their conversion in Slovakia in the 18th century. They didn't know at the time they did this work that there were any continuing Hutterites in existence anywhere. But when Volkan's book on Anabaptist songs was read by the outstanding Mennonite historian John Horsch in Indiana, Horsch immediately put Volkan in touch with the real Hutterites, the Hutterites who had continued to live and flourish eventually in the United States and Canada. And through Horsch's good work, Volkan got in contact with Elias Walter, a Canadian Hutterite bishop, who had the missing text of the Hutterite Great Chronicle in his possession. And so Walter in Canada did a manuscript, handwritten copy of the Hutterite Great Chronicle and sent it to Volkan in Vienna. Volkan translated this Hutterite Great Chronicle into the 1923 modern German version of the Great Chronicle, the history book of the Hutterite brothers. And eventually, in 1943, in the middle of World War II, this went through a second edition, which was even better from a scholarly standpoint because it reproduced the Hutterite Great Chronicle not in modern German language, but in the early modern German in which it had originally been written. So, in this way, the Hutterites in Canada and the United States were put in contact with Hutterite scholars in Austria. Lothar, for his part, then connected the dots and figured out how the Hutterites had survived, how a group of Hutterites had taken off from Slovakia to Transylvania, moved further east to Ukraine, and in 1874, to escape Russian conscription, moved lock, stock, and barrel to the United States and Canada. And so, as a result of Mennonite intermediaries, the Austrian scholars and the surviving Hutterites came into contact with each other. Volkan, in turn, found a successor for him. Robert Friedman was a young man of Jewish ethnic origin who was just fresh from fighting in the Habsburg armies in the First World War. He became totally fascinated with the Hutterites, took up Hutterite studies, and became Volkan's successor. In 1939, the Nazis imprisoned him, and Friedman was able to escape through the good offices of Roland Baton and Harold Bender, important Reformation historians of that time, by way of England to the United States. And in 1945, Friedman was set up with Bender's help at Western Michigan University, Kalamazoo, which was just a bit to the north of Goshen College in Indiana, which was the center of American Mennonite studies at that time. Friedman, in turn, had a follower, Leonard Gross, a man whom I know well, who wrote an important book in 1980 about the later history of the Hutterites. But there was a problem with this way of writing Hutterite history. It was written entirely from Hutterite sources and from the Hutterite point of view. And the Hutterite point of view was not particularly charitable toward other Anabaptist groups in Moravia. These historians were fascinated by the Hutterites, sympathetic to them. They told the story of Hutterite history from the Hutterite point of view. By the 1960s, that kind of history writing came to seem to have problems. To me, to Jarold Zeman at the same time. The 1960s began with the death of Harold S. Bender, the grand old man of Anabaptist history in the United States, who had made a wonderful contribution to the history of Anabaptism, but who wanted to do only the history of good Anabaptists. He didn't want to talk about the bad Anabaptist. People of his generation said, whenever you do the history of a religious group, you don't talk about the aberrations, you don't talk about the mistakes that happened in the course of it. You talk only about the exemplary representatives of the tradition. So, at the beginning of Jarold Zeman's book, which he published in 1967, he said, and I quote from him, "Admittedly, the Hutterite brethren accounted for the majority of Moravian Anabaptists. Their proportionate strength kept increasing in the second half of the 16th century. Nevertheless, the non-Hutterite groups played a very important role in Moravian Anabaptism, both through their contacts with Anabaptist centers in other countries and by their relationship with the population of Moravia. With the exception of Balthasar Hubmaier, who stands at the very beginning of Moravian Anabaptism, and whom I'll talk about later, Zeman said most of the other leaders and groups have not received satisfactory treatment in the previous research. End of the quotation. And so Jarold Zeman's contribution was to widen the understanding of Moravian Anabaptism from the idea of it being exclusively about the Hutterites. Furthermore, it's become increasingly evident that there were problems with simply taking over the account of the Hutterite Chronicle, especially for the history of early Anabaptism in Moravia, for the years from 1526 to 1535. Recently, a German living in Hungary, Matthias Rauert, has published an article which brings out the problems with the Hutterite Chronicle. The Hutterite Chronicle was begun, according to Robert Friedman, in the late 1560s by a man named Caspar Breitmichael, who was the chief scribe of the Hutterite Brotherhood, working in its central headquarters in Moravia. Breitmichael wrote about the early years and continued his account to 1542. But then it was taken over by a later chief scribe of the Hutterite community, a man named Halprecht Zapf. Zapf was chief scribe of the Hutterite Brotherhood from 1578 until 1593, and he took up Breitmichael's project and brought the Chronicle up to 1591. In other words, to his own time. Now, Rauert shows very convincingly that in the time that it was produced, the Hutterite Chronicle was, to quote Rauert, an experimental work that fell short of being an official Hutterite statement. It was permitted by the Hutterite leadership, but it wasn't conceived of in the time in which it was composed as an official history of the Hutterite Brotherhood. For one thing, it was put together partly by drawing on a library of documents that the Hutterites kept, which included Anabaptist teachers and leaders who had marked doctrinal differences from the Hutterites. Balthasar Hubmaier and Pilgrim Marpeck are prominent names here. And it became authoritative, according to Rauert, and I'm perfectly convinced by this argument, only after the exile of the Hutterites from Moravia, only after the Hutterites were chased to Slovakia in the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1622. It was the time of Andreas Ehrenpreis, a major leader of the Hutterite Brotherhood from 1639 to 1662, that the Hutterite Chronicle came to be accepted by the Hutterites themselves as the history of the Hutterite Brotherhood. And so what we have is a striking relativizing of the main source that was used for writing Hutterite history. The first 10 years of the Brotherhood, which were very crucial, were remembered at a distance of 35 years in the first place, and they became authoritative only at a distance of 135 years. Now, Rauert admits that you can't simply throw the Hutterite Chronicle away. One thing that is very striking in the Hutterite Chronicle is that the Hutterite Chronicle provides the only source telling about the first Anabaptist baptisms in Zurich on January 21st, 1525. There have been attempts by some Dutch historians to argue that there was a parallel source besides the Hutterite source. But those attempts have been completely exploded. The Hutterite Chronicle is the sole source of the beginning of the Anabaptist movement in Zurich in January 1525. But we have confirming sources in the Zurich judicial archives that show people baptizing in villages outside Zurich the day after January 21st, 1525. And so there's ample basis to trust the Hutterite Chronicle on this. What you can't trust the Hutterite Chronicle on is all the nasty things that were said about the leaders who were competing with Jakob Hutter for leadership of Moravian Anabaptism before Jakob Hutter established control of one branch in 1533. That's the place where things get very murky indeed. Almost all of the competing Anabaptist leaders in Moravia were looked at as false brethren, as scoundrels of one type or another. This is the beginning of something that happened in Moravia. It goes in present scholarship by the language, by the term micro-denominationalism. The Anabaptist movements split up, starting in the early 1530s, into a group of competing brotherhoods, each of which denounced the rest and regarded itself as the true expression of the revived Christian church. Incidentally, some of the people I've been talking about, Rudolf Volkan, the man whose book about the songs of the Anabaptist led to the discovery of the Canadian and American Hutterites. Robert Friedman, whom I knew in his last years in Michigan. And here is the trajectory of Hutterite wanderings. Starting from the Tyrol, 1529, moving ever eastward until finally, from Russia, you see the last escape from Europe by the Hutterites. But our focus is on Moravia. Now this is a map of the present Czech Republic that is color-coded. Bohemia is the green. You can see the colors, you can see the distinctions of the colors, can't you? Moravia is the light blue, and Silesia is the pink at the edge of the map. These were all part of one united monarchy, but Bohemia is much less important in the story of Anabaptist life than Moravia and Silesia, which is a point that Jarold Zeman has helped to establish. Zeman's big book, The Anabaptist and the Czech Brethren, 1526 to 1628, which is the period from the establishment of Anabaptism in Moravia in 1526 until the last Bohemian brethren were expelled from Moravia in 1628. First of all, the Counter-Reformation expelled the Anabaptist in 1622, and then in 1628 they expelled the Bohemian brethren. This, as Dr. Zeman's daughter has told us, was the publication of a dissertation that was done at Zurich University, completed in 1965. Zeman gave himself a very important project, and that was to explore the old evangelical theory about the emergence of the radical Reformation and the Baptist. The old evangelical theory argued for a sort of apostolic succession of medieval evangelical sects that continued in direct contact with each other until they merged into Anabaptism and baptism at the time of the Reformation. And so you couldn't pick a more important topic if you were doing Anabaptist and Baptist history than to investigate whether there was indeed this kind of continuity between medieval evangelical sectarians and the free churches of the Reformation. According to this theory, the Waldensians and then the Bohemian brethren were the ancestors of the Anabaptist. And there was some plausibility for looking at things in this way. Zeman points out in his book that in 1480, several hundred German-speaking Waldensians were received into the Bohemian Brethren, and they established the German-speaking branch of the Bohemian Brethren. You must remember the Bohemian Brethren was the church in which Zeman himself was brought up in Czechoslovakia. And there were striking similarities between the Anabaptist and one branch of Bohemian Brethren on matters of religious ethics, such as rejection of war, participation in government, swearing oaths. And the Bohemian Brethren rebaptized adult converts from other religious groups. But they continued infant baptism for their own children. But Zeman studied this subject very thoroughly at a place where the descendants of the medieval sects, which the Bohemian Brethren were, and the Anabaptists were in close contact. And he wanted to decide, does the old evangelical thesis stand up? And he came to a negative conclusion. It's very interesting that this is a book, very important book, and one of its chief characteristics is that on the basis of his personal scholarly integrity, Zeman came to a negative conclusion on this subject. It's an indication of the kind of scholar he was. He concluded that the ideas of non-resistance developed independently of each other among 15th century Czech religious radicals and 16th century Swiss German Anabaptists. And then he went into what fascinated him especially, the one attempt at merger between the Bohemian Brethren and a group of Anabaptists, which, as his book demonstrates, took place shortly after Anabaptism had appeared in Moravia in 1528. These talks were encouraged by Moravian noblemen who were sympathetic to both groups, both to the Bohemian Brethren and to the Anabaptists. Now, one of the things that really struck Zeman in examining these merger talks in 1528 is that the Anabaptists in these merger talks were neither of the two groups that were described in the Hutterite Chronicle. They were not the people who led to the Hutterites, and they were not the followers of Balthasar Hubmaier. And so this demonstrated that, according to Zeman, there was a third type within early Moravian Anabaptism, a significant group of spiritualizing Anabaptists. And he names their names, names the names of the particular spiritualizing Anabaptists, and concludes that in Moravia all types of Anabaptism were represented, not just the Hutterite type. So Zeman did not find continuity between the Bohemian Czech-speaking sectarians and the Anabaptists who came to Moravia, above all as German refugees. But he did find a much greater variety of Anabaptists in Moravia than anyone would have thought on the basis of doing Anabaptist history from the Hutterite Chronicle. There's another, even more important effect of Zeman's monograph, his book of 1969. He did a historical geography, a topography of Moravian Anabaptism. When he began on his project, he decided, I can only find out if there was continuity between Bohemian Brethren and Anabaptist if I know where the Bohemian Brethren had communities and where the Anabaptists had communities, and determine whether there were communities in the same places and what kind of contact they had with each other. Fortunately, Zeman, working in Zurich and in Canada at different times, had access to what he described as a monumental earlier study of the location of congregations of Bohemian Brethren prior to their expulsion from Bohemia and Moravia in 1628. Now he himself undertook to construct a similar parallel historical geography of Anabaptist settlements in Moravia during the roughly 100 years in which they were present in Moravia from 1526 until 1622. The location of Anabaptist settlements in Moravia had begun with the Hutterite-centered history. But of course what they did was simply to check down where there was a Hutterite community. Writing in the Mennonite Quarterly Review in an article in 1966, Zeman wrote, "The early and repeated publications of the Hutterite Chronicles inevitably led to a one-sided dependence of topographical studies on the Hutterite sources, and eventually to the creation of a Hutterite image of Moravian Anabaptism. The common assumption in the literature dealing with Moravian Anabaptism that has been that by the middle of the 16th century, if not earlier, all other Anabaptists, with the insignificant exception of a few scattered Swiss brethren, had united with the Hutterites, and from then on Moravian Anabaptism could be equated with Hutterite Anabaptism." Now he supplemented the Hutterite sources with non-Hutterite Anabaptist sources, and more important, he drew on a vast literature of non-Anabaptist sources. There was a great Czech historical geography, a topographical study that ran to 56 regular volumes and a number of supplementary volumes in the years between, it was published in the years between 1900 and 1948. Living in Canada from 1948, Zeman had no direct access to the Czech archives, but nevertheless, he compiled this topographical study from Czech sources which he acknowledged to be of uneven scholarly merit. Not all of the topographical studies that were published between 1900 and 1948 were of equal scholarly worth, but they were what he had. In this way, he almost doubled the number of known Anabaptist settlements in Moravia in the 100 years in which Anabaptists were settled in Moravia. Despite his effort to redress the balance, Zeman's topography nevertheless demonstrates the growing Hutterite dominance in Moravian Anabaptism, especially after 1535 and 1536, in which a great number of Anabaptists were expelled from Moravia at the insistence of Ferdinand I of Austria, who was at that time King of Moravia. His work greatly increased, nevertheless, the awareness of non-Hutterite Anabaptist groups in Moravia, of their importance and of their relative longevity. His topographical studies reinforce his insistence that, to quote him again, Moravia was more than simply one of the few lands where Anabaptists survived through the 16th century. It became and remained the central place of refuge where Anabaptists of all shades of belief and all ethnic backgrounds met, either for short visits or in permanent settlement. Above all, Zeman increased our geographical understanding of Anabaptism. 3 years after the appearance of Zeman's book, Peter Clausen's quantitative study of Anabaptism established that the years 1528 and 1529 were the big years of Anabaptist persecution. Anabaptists fled down the Danube and then followed the trade routes that took them to Moravia and Silesia. The weakness of Zeman's approach, which he acknowledged, was that he was concentrating on the very early years of Moravian Anabaptism. These years, 1526, 1527, and 1528, which led up to the aborted attempt of some spiritualist Anabaptists to merge with the Bohemian Brethren, were really the culminating point of his research. He didn't push the research beyond 1528, except in the historical topography, which set an agenda for later research. Zeman's historical topography implies the presence of 9 non-Hutterite Anabaptist groups in Moravia. Subsequent research, which I'm perfectly willing to defend, has reduced this number to 5 or perhaps 4. Besides the Hutterites, who are obviously a presence, an Anabaptist presence in Moravia, they're the Austerlitz Brethren, a group that becomes more and more important the more we understand them. The Gabrielites, spiritualizers, followers of the Nuremberg Furrier Gabriel Ascherham. The Sabbatarians, who were the successors, as it turned out, of Balthasar Hubmaier after Hubmaier's execution in Vienna, and the Swiss Brethren. Now we can add to these the Philippites if one wants to distinguish the Philippites from the Swiss Brethren. And there's a case for distinguishing them, and there's a case against distinguishing them. Moravia, however, was the place where micro-denominational distinctions arose among the Anabaptists in the 1530s and the 1540s. From then on, you had a multiplicity of Anabaptist groups, each announcing that it was the true Church of God in the last days. In the 1550s and 1560s, a similar kind of splintering occurred among the Mennonites or Doopsgezinden in the Netherlands and North Germany. Zeman said of himself, a historian who undertakes research into a phase of Moravian history and does not have access to the archives and libraries in Czechoslovakia works under a serious handicap. This, however, was the situation of all Western European and North American scholars of Anabaptism after the communist seizure of power in Prague in 1948, and for all practical purposes from 1939 and Hitler's occupation of Czechoslovakia. This situation changed only with the Velvet Revolution in Prague of November and December 1989, of which we're observing the 25th anniversary in all sorts of places. Jarold Zeman, however, set the agenda for a number of subsequent historians, particularly Werner Packel, whom I had the honor to supervise, and Martin Rothkegel, who is a fellow of the Acadia Centre for Anabaptist and Baptist Studies. They've done most to establish our present picture of Moravian Anabaptism. but it was Jarold Zeman who set this opening of wider source material and wider understanding of Moravian Anabaptism on its way. Tomorrow night, I'll look at what was done in continuing Jarold Zeman's heritage by Werner Packel and by Martin Rothkegel. But tonight, we'll concentrate on Jarold Zeman and the great contribution that he made to widening and developing a critical understanding of Moravian Anabaptism. He argued that Moravia was the most important place where the Anabaptists lived in the 16th century. Now, I've gotten pushback from some of my colleagues who say that that's a vast underestimate of the Netherlands. But it would have to be either the one place or the other that are the keys to the continuance of the Anabaptist heritage. The Germans were quite brutal to the Anabaptists, and the Swiss, although they didn't quite kill them all, had to be continually urged by their Dutch Reformed co-religionists to be more tolerant, more forbearing with the Anabaptists in Switzerland who wouldn't join the official Swiss Reformed Church in the Protestant parts of Switzerland. And so, more than Switzerland, and certainly more than Germany, Moravia, and perhaps the Netherlands too, are the keys to the survival and eventual flourishing of the Anabaptists. And Jarold Zeman made a vast contribution to our understanding this. Thank you.